On the battlefields of Northwest Europe, German machine gunners learned to look for the shape of command. A raised arm, a map case, a man standing half a second too long while others waited for direction. In the old logic of war, that man mattered more than the rifleman beside him, because if he fell, the unit might hesitate, and hesitation under machine gun fire could turn an advance into a graveyard. So German fire often searched for officers first. The lieutenant with the pistol, the captain near the wireless set, the figure moving between sections trying to pull order out of smoke. It was not a foolish method. In many armies, command flowed down like water through a narrow pipe. Break the pipe at the top, and the men below became confused, isolated, and slow. But against British infantry, especially by the later years of the war, that calculation did not always produce the collapse German defenders expected. A British platoon was not simply one young officer followed by 30 silent men. It was a layered fighting organism. Behind the platoon commander stood the platoon sergeant. Inside each section stood a corporal. Beside him, often, a lance corporal controlled the Bren gun team. The visible officer might be killed, wounded, or pinned down, but command did not disappear with him. It shifted downward, almost automatically, into men who had already been carrying responsibility long before the first shot was fired. This was what made the British response difficult to read. To German observers, British attacks could appear cautious, even slow, compared with the violent speed of German assault tactics. Yet beneath that methodical surface was a stubborn small unit discipline that did not depend on one officer shouting every order. If the officer fell, the sergeant understood the purpose. If the sergeant was hit, the corporal still knew the section's task. If the corporal went down, the Bren gunner and rifleman knew the rhythm that had been drilled into them until it became instinct. Get down, observe, return fire, keep the enemy's head low, and move when movement was possible. The Germans were not facing an army without officers. They were facing an army whose authority had been deliberately spread through the section and platoon. And the deeper the war went, the more dangerous that quiet British system became. That quiet system did not appear by accident. It was hammered into the British Army by the bitter lessons of early defeat. In 1940, Britain had watched a professional army driven back through Belgium and France, forced to escape at Dunkirk without the heavy equipment it had carried across the Channel. The lesson was not that courage had failed. British soldiers had fought hard in many places. The lesson was that modern war punished hesitation, poor communications, and units that waited too long for perfect orders. From that point onward, training became more practical, more urgent, and more focused on what small groups of men could do under fire. The British Army placed enormous emphasis on fieldcraft, section tactics, fire and movement, and battle drill. Battle drill mattered because it gave ordinary soldiers a shared pattern of action when confusion arrived. A section did not need a lecture in the middle of a field. It needed a reflex. Where was the Bren gun going? Who was covering? Who was moving? Who was watching the flank? These answers had to be known before the first burst of German fire. This made the British section a far more serious problem than it appeared on paper. To a German defender, a British section might seem slow for the first few seconds after being hit. Men went flat. Nobody rushed blindly forward. But that pause was not collapse. It was recognition. The corporal was locating the enemy. The Bren team was searching for a firing position. The riflemen were spreading out, not bunching together. The lance corporal was helping keep the gun working, because the Bren was not just another weapon. It was the center of the section's firepower. Here the German misunderstanding deepened. German doctrine respected machine guns, but it often assumed the enemy's smaller units would become helpless if officers were removed. British infantry doctrine pushed responsibility into the section itself. The officer's plan mattered, but the section's immediate survival depended on the corporal and the Bren group. Once that group was firing, the rest of the section could move. Once movement began, the attack had not died. It had simply changed shape. This was why killing a British officer could create confusion but not paralysis. The officer might have been the man carrying the larger plan, yet the corporal knew the next hedge, the next ditch, the next doorway, and the next burst of fire needed to cross it. This difference became clearer in Normandy, where the fighting did not reward parade ground perfection. It rewarded men who could make sense of small pieces of ground under impossible pressure. A road junction, an orchard wall, a ruined farmhouse, a hedge line that hid a machine gun until the first man stepped into the open. These were not places where a platoon commander could stand upright and direct everything like a man moving pieces on a map. In the country around Caen, British and Canadian troops advanced slowly against some of the strongest German formations in the West. German commanders used villages, woods, anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine guns to turn every approach into a test of nerve. To the impatient observer, this could look like British caution. To the men inside the fight, it was something colder and more practical. The ground was being read one deadly yard at a time. Here the British system showed its real value. A platoon officer might be responsible for the attack, but he could not personally control every section once smoke, walls, and enemy fire broke the battlefield into fragments. One section might be pinned near a ditch. Another might be out of sight behind a building. A third might be crawling forward with the Bren gun while the platoon sergeant tried to restore order behind them. In those moments, command became less about rank and more about trained habits. A corporal did not need to understand the entire operational plan for the liberation of France. He needed to know his section's immediate purpose. Suppress that window, reach that wall, hold that flank, protect the Bren, keep the riflemen spread out. This kind of responsibility made British infantry difficult to decapitate at the lower level. The German bullet that killed an officer could damage the plan, but it did not erase the method. The Germans had their own tradition of tactical initiative, and it would be wrong to describe them as rigid machines with no flexibility. Their junior leaders could be extremely capable. But by 1944, Germany was fighting under growing strain. Casualties, shortages, exhausted formations, and Hitler's insistence on holding ground reduced the freedom even good German officers once possessed. British infantry, meanwhile, had learned to fight inside a larger Allied machine of artillery, armor, engineers, and air power. The British section did not have to win the war alone. It had to survive long enough, hold long enough, and move well enough for that machine to keep pressing forward. The most important British weapon in this system was not always the rifle, the Bren, or even the tank. Very often it was control. Not the control of one officer over every man, but the control of violence itself. British infantry had learned, sometimes painfully, that bravery without coordination could be wasted in minutes. A section charging too early could be cut down. A tank advancing without infantry could be blinded by enemy soldiers hiding in ruins. Infantry moving without artillery could be stopped by a single machine gun that nobody had suppressed. So British battle discipline became a matter of timing. The section did not exist alone. It listened for the guns. It watched for the armor. It waited for smoke. It moved when covering fire made movement possible. To German soldiers trained to admire speed, this could look like hesitation. But to the British soldier on the ground, it was survival shaped into method. This was where the death of an officer had less effect than the Germans hoped. The officer might have arranged the attack, but the rhythm of the attack had already been passed into the platoon. The men knew that the Bren gun had to dominate the enemy position. They knew that riflemen did not bunch together. They knew that a section commander had to keep the fire going while another group moved. They knew that if the wireless failed, the next sensible action was not to stand and wait, but to keep working toward the last known objective. The British Army had no shortage of class divisions, traditions, and formal ranks. It was not an army without hierarchy. But war had forced practical knowledge downward. A sergeant who had survived North Africa, Sicily, Italy, or the early fighting in Normandy was not merely a voice repeating an officer's orders. He was a professional memory of the platoon. He knew which men were steady under fire, which ones carried extra ammunition, which Bren team could be trusted, and which young replacement needed a hard look more than a speech. That kind of leadership was difficult for the Germans to destroy with one shot. They could kill the officer, but they could not kill the habits built by training, experience, and repetition. They could disrupt the plan, but not always the purpose. And once German defenders understood that British sections would keep crawling, firing, and reorganizing even after command appeared broken, a new fear entered the battlefield. The British attack might be slow, but it had a disturbing ability to continue. By the winter of 1944, this mattered more than ever, because the German army was no longer the same instrument that had crossed Europe in 1940. It still contained brave and skilled soldiers. It still had dangerous weapons, disciplined machine gun crews, and officers who understood ground with remarkable skill. But the system around them was breaking. Experienced leaders had been lost in Russia, North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Replacement formations were thinner. Fuel was scarce. Communications were unreliable. Orders from above were often shaped less by military judgment than by political refusal to give ground. Against that weakening structure, British infantry did not need to appear spectacular. It needed to be consistent. A British battalion could take losses and still pass tasks downward. A company commander could be cut off, and platoons could still fight toward their immediate objectives. A platoon commander could be hit, and the sergeant could gather the loose ends. A section commander could fall, and the second-in-command could keep the Bren gun firing. This was not romantic chaos. It was controlled continuity. That continuity was strengthened by something German observers sometimes underestimated: the regimental culture of the British Army. A British soldier did not simply belong to a numbered formation on a map. He belonged to a regiment, a battalion, a company, and finally to a section of men whose faces he knew. That identity could be old-fashioned, even stubborn, but under pressure it gave small groups a reason to hold together when formal command became blurred. There was also a practical, emotional difference. British soldiers were not trained to think that every movement required a fresh speech from an officer. They were trained to recognize the immediate pattern of the fight. If the enemy fire came from the right, the section reacted. If the Bren gun stopped, someone fed it, moved it, or replaced the man beside it. If the objective was a village edge, a railway embankment, or a line of trees, the men did not need to understand every corps-level decision behind it. They needed to keep their small part of the advance alive. This was the battlefield truth the Germans struggled to explain. British infantry looked ordinary until the moment it should have broken. Then it revealed the hidden strength of its design. Not brilliance in a single commander, but resilience spread through many smaller hands. By the final months of the war, the German soldier facing British infantry was not simply fighting men in khaki. He was fighting a system that refused to vanish when the most visible leader disappeared. The officer could fall in a field outside Cannes. A wireless could be smashed by shellfire. A sergeant could be wounded while pulling men into cover. Yet the section still had its habits, its weapon teams, its regimental pride, and its next small task. That was the real answer to the German confusion. British soldiers did not fight without officers because officers were unimportant. They fought on because the best officers had already done their work before the crisis arrived. They had trained their sergeants, trusted their corporals, explained the objective, and built routines strong enough to survive the first shock of battle. The British way was rarely glamorous. It did not always look fast. It did not always produce clean victories. In Normandy, Italy, and Northwest Europe, it could be costly, grinding, and painfully methodical. But it gave the British Army something Germany increasingly lacked by 1944: endurance at the lowest level. A platoon could bend without instantly breaking. A section could lose its voice of command and still keep firing. And that was what the Germans could not easily understand. You could shoot the officer pointing the way, but if every section already knew the road, the attack did not die. It simply lowered its head, tightened its grip on the Bren gun, and kept coming. If you found this story valuable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more untold battlefield history.